Hello and welcome to another War Thunder video, and well, I'm going to be doing a couple of videos, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth over the ammunition belt video that Gaijin did such a fantastic job on, as we all know, and take it a little bit more in depth than just looking at the MG-151s on a Japanese aircraft. So, for starters, what I'm going to go over? Well, I'm going to go over the different ammunition belts for each each gun that the belts for each gun that each nation gets access to. However, I will not be going over, like, for example, the Mark V Hispano and the Mark II Hispano. I'll only go over one of them, and with the Americans here, we got the A&M3. I will not be going over the A&M3 and the A&M2 because they both have the same belts. They have exactly the same belts as each other. So, the only difference between those two guns is the rate of fire. Another thing is I will not be going over cross-nation guns. So, for example, the Mark II Hispano, I'm not going to be going over that until I get to the Brits. The MG-151, the MG-117, or the MG-17, the Japanese guns. You know, I'm not gonna go over any of that until I get to those specific nations. Right, I think that's all for that. So, how about we first start off with the Americans? So, I'm going to go ahead and get the F2 out of the way and say that, well, basically, if you are wondering what belts you have to use and you have an F2 Sabre, I would recommend that you uninstall the game or that you go back and fly lower tier. You either use air target or stealth. If you actually needed somebody to answer that question, then I don't know what's wrong with you. Or maybe you just decided to spend $1,000 and get yourself an F2 Sabre, in which case, good luck. Next, the 30 caliber machine gun that you are going to be extraordinarily familiar with and absolutely resent in lower tier Americans, and that's the 7.62mm Browning machine gun. So, at first glance, you might think that you've actually got a couple of options here, but in actuality, you don't. You really only have one. The default belt is, it's not great. It's not bad. As far as default belts go, it could be a hell of a lot worse. It's got one tracer. It's got 3 omnipurpose ball ammunition, 3 omnipurpose ball bullets, and then an AP and an incendiary. It's pretty crap. As far as default belts go, it's not the worst that you could have, but overall, you really don't want to be using these. Universal, you got a tracer, an AP, and an incendiary. That's pretty crap, to be honest. You got the first bullet that comes out, the one that you actually see is tracer, and then you got an AP and incendiary, and then you go back to a tracer. It's pretty crap. The tracers, you got 1 AP and 4 tracer bullets, which is just absolutely worthless. I mean, even the kinetic properties of tracers, or even with the kinetic buff that Gaijin gave, like AP, tracer, and practice ammo, like 157 or 159 or maybe 16, it's still pretty horrible. You really don't want to be using these. The belts that you're really going to want to use for the 30 cals are just stealth. You got 3 AP and 2 incendiary, and honestly, this belt is absolutely atrocious. You don't have any API. It does exactly what it says on the tin, nothing more. You got 3 AP, you got 2 incendiaries. They don't really set fires very often or very well. The AP bullets are, well, they're AP. If they penetrate, they penetrate and don't do anything. Yeah, just load stealth with these things and just forget about the fact that you've got them. As far as 50 cals go, well, we got 3 different kinds of 50 cal belts for the Americans, and they're actually unique in this. For starters, we've got the early belts that you will be all too familiar with, and you will absolutely hate. Now, for starters, with these belts, you will get them on this, both of these. So all of the tier 1s that get 50 cals, you will use these belts. The P40s have them. Both the Wildcats get them. And all of the Airacobras have them. I think it changes once you get to the King Cobra, but these 3 planes all have the same 50 cal belts. Let's see, yep. And those belts are these. You got, for default, these are, they're pretty awful, to be honest. You got a tracer belt, you got a tracer bullet, you got a ball, omni-purpose ball, you got an incendiary, and you got AP. It's not really all that great. You got Uni, which is 3 AP, a tracer, and an incendiary. You got ground targets, which is 1 tracer and 3 AP. You got tracers, which are 3 tracers and 1 AP. And then you got stealth, where you got 2 AP and or AP, incendiary, AP. And the only belts that you're going to want to use on these things are universal or stealth. Tracers are awful, ground targets are awful, default is awful, and honestly, the Uni and stealth are pretty atrocious as well. The only good things about the 50 cal at this tier is that it's a half-inch bullet, and the amount of damage that 50 cals do now is astronomical, but you're still going to want to get better belts. Like, the amount of difference between the belts and the A30, the amount of difference between the A36 and the P40 is just astronomical in the amount of damage that it does, just because of the belts. And I guess while we're on the P39, we can talk about the 37mm. Now, for 37mm in general, 37 and higher in general, you'll have 3 types of belts. You'll have an HE belt, which is the default on the P39. You'll have an armored target belt, or basically an AP belt, which is ground targets here on the P39. There we go. No, actually this one has a mix of AP and HE. And then you'll generally also have 1, maybe 2 belts that are different combinations of AP and HE. That's actually kind of odd. I didn't think that the P39 had a mix of the two in both of them. But for the P39, you got 3 belts. You got default, Uni, and ground targets. The only difference between Uni and ground targets is that with ground target you get 1 extra AP round that will waste all of your time. Whereas with Uni you get 2 HE and 1 AP. But if you want to use this thing for air-to-ground roll, then you might as well be trying to kill ground targets with a pea shooter, because you'll probably have better luck. And it's not really designed for it. The ground ordnance for this thing is awful. These M8 rockets are useless. So just load default, HE, and go shoot some bombers down and hope that you actually do. Otherwise, you get to kill them from these things. The second set of belts that you get access to for the US, 50 cal wise, are on the A36, and these belts, you get access to these belts from the A36, I think is the earliest you'll get them. And then you get them starting on the Corsair all the way up to this, up to the F4U4. That's the last time you'll see these belts. The Bearcat doesn't have them. And that is these. And for the default, you got a tracer, 2 ball, and an incendiary and API. These actually are a pretty big step up from the previous belts. They're still not all that great, but you can get kills with them. Next you got Uni, which is 3 API, a tracer and an incendiary, so you swap out the AP for API, and that makes a huge difference, let me tell you. Next you got ground targets, which is a tracer, 3 AP, an API, and an incendiary. I don't know exactly how good these belts are. I would just, since I'm an air-to-air pilot, I just stick with either Uni or Stealth. The tracers, you got 5 tracer bullets and then an API. Don't even bother trying to use these belts. It's horrible. And with Stealth, you got an AP, 2 API, and 2 incendiaries. So you swap out 2 of the AP rounds for 2 API, and they're pretty good. Overall, I would probably say, like I said, either go for Uni or Stealth. Uni probably if you're going to fly realistic or sim, Stealth if you're an arcade. For the next set of 50 cal belts, we'll do the 50 cals first. We'll go over here to the Bearcats, and we'll do the 20 millimeters at the same time. So first off, we'll do the 50s. And the default belts for these 50 cals, and by the way, you will get these belts starting on the P47. Let's check the King Cobras just to make sure. Nope, those have the old belts as well. You start on the P47, both of them get them. And then, let's see, I think you keep them. No, actually, that's got a turret. Yeah, that one's got different belts. I don't believe you get them on the P38. Nope, the P38s keep the old belts as well. So you get them on all 3 of the P47s, you get them on the 4 P51s, you get them on the Bearcat first in the Navy line, and then any 50 cal armed plane after the P47N and the F8F1 will have these kinds of belts. So the F25 has the same belts as the P47N. And those belts are this. The default, you got an API-T, 2 API, and an incendiary. And as far as default belts go, these are actually not bad. They're not overly fantastic, especially not for the tier, but in terms of overall composition, they could be a hell of a lot worse. Next, for the Uni, we got 2 API, an API-T, and then you got 2 incendiaries. So you swap out one of the API rounds for an API-T, and these are actually quite good. Next you got ground targets, you got an API-T, an incendiary, 2 AP, and 2 API. These are I've actually heard pretty good things about these belts. I have never used them myself, but I probably won't either. And then we get to the next belt, which is the tracers, and these are actually pretty good tracer belts. It's all API-T, and if you ever see a whole bunch of lasers coming out of a P-47 or any American plane, this is what they're using. Stealth is API Incendiary, API Incendiary, and these are actually pretty good belts, although I think the Universal is probably a better belt overall. Just because of how much more API you have. Next, we go into the 20 millimeters, and the 20 millimeters have probably the best default belts in the game. You've got 2 HE and an API. These default belts are absolutely fantastic. And remember, these are the same belts that you get on this thing, and that. So all of these the Canon Hellcat has the same belts as the the F9 F8. So the default, absolutely amazing. Universal, you got an HE API, HE API. So you swap, so you stick one API shell in between these two HE shells, and there you go. That's Uni. Ground targets, you got two API and an HE and a practice round for some stupid reason. As far as taking out ground targets in terms of like for killing pillboxes, since I think you can still do that. These are actually pretty good. You can kill light tanks with them, although I wouldn't recommend using these in ground battles, although if you're using a Bearcat in ground battles, you'll be using these. And then we get the air target belts, which is 3 HE and an API. These are actually fantastic belts. And unlike Hispanos, which we'll get to later, these don't actually let you down. And then we got stealth, which is 3 HE and a practice round. So overall, these are absolutely fantastic belts all around. If you're going to go for ground targets, I'd probably go for Uni, just so that you don't have the tracer, or the practice round, excuse me, and you still got 2 HE, so you can still go after aircraft. If you do actually want to go after aircraft, use air targets or stealth. Up to you, depends on how good of a shot you are. I would personally prefer air targets in sim and realistic, and then in arcade just stealth. Or if you even want to, you can use default. Air target and default are pretty comparable. In terms of overall effectiveness, there really isn't a whole lot of difference between the two, but you know, it's an option. If you want an extra HE round, go ahead. And next we're going to go to the 75mm, and I think this is going to be the last of the actual belts, and I'm going to attempt, if I have time, to try to splice in some actual demonstrations of how these belts, how good these belts perform. Except with the 75mm, because this is an absolute pain in the ass to aim, for one thing, and two, if you actually hit somebody with that, they're dead. So, also, these are the turret belts for 50 cal ammunition, at least from like tier 3 on. The default belts are pretty awful, as you can tell. Armored targets you don't want to use, and then Uni, default is a tracer, an AP, an incendiary, and an API. Pretty useless. Armored targets is 3 AP and a tracer. Uni is 3 API and a tracer. So if you use Uni for your gunners, pretty much. The offensive armament, on the Grizzly anyway, is the same belts as on the A36, and then the 75mm, and this is what I meant earlier, you got a default belt, which is HE, AP, HE, AP, HE, and then you got an armored target belt, which is all AP, and then you got a ground target belt, which is all HE. So, pretty straightforward, really. And that pretty much does it for the US, since, yep, pretty much. They don't have any other guns that I can think of off the top of my head. So yeah, join me next time and we'll have a look at the Russians.